Before we left the house, my brother said, "Can I come with you?" And we said, "No, it's fine. It'll be fine." And I still remember he was standing on the upstairs banister and he said, "Can I get a pair of jeans, Mom?" And she goes, "Sure." And, we left the house, and that was the last time I saw him. And I just felt horrible about being the sibling that got to survive. I felt like I couldn't save him. I felt like I failed him.
Welcome to My Legacy. Before we begin today's episode, we want to let our listeners and viewers know that we will be discussing issues related to violence, suicide, and mental health. Some of the topics may be distressing. If you or someone you know is struggling, we encourage you to seek professional support. Resources like the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, dial 988, or the Crisis Text Hotline, text HOME to 741741, are available 24/7. Please know that this conversation is for information purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Your well-being is critically important. Please listen at your own pace, and please don't hesitate to take breaks or skip ahead if needed. Today we have the privilege of sitting down with Nina Purewal, the international best-selling author of Let That Sht Go. Nina's journey is one of extraordinary resilience. From profound loss to profound healing, she has taken life's hardest moments and turned them into a legacy of helping others. Now, what makes our conversations on My Legacy unexpected and unique is that we don't just hear from extraordinary individuals, we hear from the people who know them best, those who have walked alongside them in their journey. Nina, thanks so much for joining us, and can you introduce us to your plus one?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us on. We are completely honored to be here. And I would like to introduce my plus one. This is Joe Lyons-Rising. Joe and I have been good friends for over 20 years. We started out working together in data analytics, so we're both data geeks at heart. We have been on the journey together of going from corporate to social enterprise. We're both authors, and we are very passionate about mental health and wellness. Joe has a company that he founded called Data Gives Back, where he donates over 25% of his earnings to an incredible organization called the Season Center for Grieving Children. But my intention of the plus one was to bring Joe on because he has an incredible story to tell, and I want him to share his platform with everybody.
But Nina, sincerely, we love you. We are inspired by your story. We're inspired by your determination. We're inspired by who you are, by what you've overcome, by what you put out in the world. And Joe, it's just awesome to have you here.
Nina, you faced a devastating loss as a teenager. In a real sense, for me, I also faced a devastating loss of a father at a very early age. But one certainly that shaped the rest of your life. Can you share what you experienced and how years later you were able to choose forgiveness?
I can see you and hear you and empathize with being a child and traumatically losing a parent. And this is why Joe and I are also good friends, because Joe has gone through childhood trauma as well, and we've been each other's grief buddies throughout, which is so important. At 16, my parents were going through a pretty tumultuous separation. Actually, my mom wanted to leave my dad after 22 years of what started out as physical abuse, and then a lot of psychological, verbal abuse. And she kind of made a promise to herself when my brother was born that when my son turns 10, if this behavior continues, I'm leaving. And sure enough, he turned 10, and she said, I can't do this anymore. This was 1996. And so she served my dad with divorce papers in December of 96. And it was 6 months of a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questionable behavior from my dad, a lot of inconsistency, and that culminated in him in May of 1997 taking his own life, and also taking my brother's as well. And, it was premeditated, and his plan was to take mine too. He obviously wanted revenge and wanted to get back at my mom and take, her kids and himself, and he burnt the house down. I did see the crime scene after the bodies were taken out. It was very intense. And in that moment, I really had nowhere to go. It was the 90s, and nobody was talking about mental health. No one was talking about, really, you were either in the psychiatric ward in the hospital or you were quote unquote normal. And I did a lot of reflecting, and this is why I'm so passionate about mental health, and specifically men and mental health, is I always think back to if my dad had had the support that people have now, would things have still gone that way? So I am just so grateful and lucky every single day to be here and to be alive. Many years later, I couldn't even grieve my brother in the beginning because I was so furious and angry with my dad. I had PTSD, I had survivor's guilt. And then I kind of numbed my pain and I repressed it, which I wouldn't recommend for anyone, but I went and got my business degree. I had a great career in sales and marketing. I was thriving and living life, and then my mom passed away and everything hit me all over again. The loss, the grief. And suddenly I had this epiphany moment that I am holding on to all of this anger and resentment about what my dad did, and he's dead and gone. So it's not impacting him anymore. Who is it impacting? It's impacting me. And it was that moment that I realized my way out of this was forgiveness. Not for him, not to right his wrong, because when we forgive, we don't have to right wrongs, we don't have to make up, we don't have to be in it's not a beautiful romantic period piece where I'm sorry, I love you. You can forgive someone who's no longer here. You can forgive someone who you don't want in your life anymore. And that's what I did. I went on a 2-year journey to forgive him, because forgiveness is freedom for you. You are letting go of the resentment. You are letting go of the anger. And it's incredible what transpired in my life after I went through that journey.
Nina, before we get to that stage, I just want to go back, because you and I have had extensive conversations on this, and I just want to say on behalf of all of us, I'm getting choked up here, just how sorry we are for the loss and the tragic nature of that loss. And I know you now look at that loss in a different way, because you also said something very powerful in so much that you had survivor's guilt because you survived.
Before we left the house, my brother said, "Can I come with you?" And we said, "No, it's fine. You'll be fine." And I still remember he was standing on the upstairs banister and he said, "Can I get a pair of jeans, Mom?" And she goes, "Sure." And, we left the house, and that was the last time I saw him. And I just felt horrible about being the sibling that got to survive. I felt like I couldn't save him. I felt like I failed him. Those last few moments played over and over and over again in my head. I just did 20 weeks of trauma healing a few years ago to address the crime scene. But survivor's guilt is real. You feel terrible for living every day when the person or someone you love so much didn't get the same opportunity.
And what is your advice? Because I'm sure that a lot of our listeners are experiencing that more than any of us even realize. And they may feel the same way, trapped and alone, and feeling that survivor's guilt.
Well, the first thing I always say now, working in mental health, is to feel those feelings, to feel the emotion. It's okay, it's healthy. But then you get to a point where you they don't want you to feel that way, those that have passed. When I think about what my brother would have wanted, or when I think about if the roles were reversed, he wouldn't want me. They don't want you to live the rest of your life wondering why, or feeling terrible that they were in this situation. They're in the light. They're happy. They're angels. They're looking down. They're not suffering. And I think that was a big aha for me. Is he's happy, and he's happy for me, and I feel him too. And he's moved on and he's free. We all struggled in that house growing up, and he's free. And so my advice would be to feel the feels, to acknowledge where they are now, and then to also surround yourself, thirdly, with people who understand, and to work through it. And I came across this organization called the Season Center for Grieving Children, which Joe donates back to, and where we are executive grief ambassadors now. And that honestly saved my life. The peer-to-peer support, and I highly recommend that if you're going through loss, you're going through tragedy or trauma, is to talk to people who are going through something similar. And I was finally in a room where teens had gone through very traumatic loss, and at 16, it's been so many years now, I still remember everybody's story. And finally I felt at home. I didn't feel misunderstood. I felt like everybody got what I was going through. But if you really do feel stuck, to get the help, because I have had I still have therapists, grief counselors, psychologists help me go through this thing called life that we are all trying to navigate.
Nina, thank you for sharing that with us. And the candor is, besides perhaps Martin, none of us can understand fully. But perhaps Joe, I know you also bring, and I asked Nina why she invited you, and part of what she spoke about your incredible ambassadorship, and also the fact that you have this unique bond, that you in your youth experienced also this profound trauma. And would you share it with us so that people out there listening know that they're also not alone, that others have experienced that journey, and especially if you can share with us some of the journey of healing?
Yeah, definitely. Nina and I now, in our 40s, we joke we're grief buddies. I do think the universe brought us together. Even though we met 20 years ago, we continued to be on this grief journey, and it kind of gets stronger year by year. I did go through significant loss as a child. In the 1980s, I lost my dad to suicide when I was 6 years old. He had struggled with bipolar and depression. And then a couple years later, my mom was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And unfortunately, she succumbed to depression herself. And she died by suicide when I was 10. And Nina and I didn't know that the first time we met, when we were doing market research and analytics, right? It's not the first thing you say to each other when you're starting a new company or working, but I think it was at a house party you had or something we had, and somehow we started talking about this, and it was like this instant magnetic force. Like I have no idea what you went through. She doesn't know what I went through, but we can incredibly empathize with each other, and that's been our connection and friendship, and it's been this journey since then.
And one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about Joe sharing his story is because, as I said earlier, men and mental health is critically important. I have done so much research and just lived experience, obviously, of what happens when, and traditionally, I know I'm generalizing here, but people who identify as men tend to not talk about their emotions as much and not go there. Women have a more supportive kind of network, and it's okay to meet up with a girlfriend and cry the whole time, and it's just not as available for men. And so I really respect Joe for creating that space, and his book does talk about grief and trauma and depression and anxiety, and I think it's important that we acknowledge what we're going through.
Well, Martin, I admire how you've been so open from a young age to encourage men to share their stories, and how you've done it so powerfully and so brilliantly.
I wish our nation had addressed mental health 30 plus years ago, but I'm grateful that we as a society are working in that vein today, and I'm grateful for you sharing your story with our audience. And we don't know what kind of, just the fact that you're able to share is healing. You're putting out healing energy into the universe, and it is vitally needed throughout our nation and our world for our society to become a better place, and maybe for a sick society to provide some medicine for itself.
And one of the things also that you both, when you talk about forgiveness, I want to just also highlight what Dr. King said about forgiveness, because one of the ways in which the civil rights movement, that they were able to continue on after your house is bombed, after dogs are being sick on you, is that what that he said is that you separate the evil act from the individual. That is also a way to forgive, because Nina, you're talking about you don't forget, but you are able to, and you don't say that what happened is okay. But one thing that he taught is that we separate the act from the individual.
I love that. That's so powerful. And I love that you both talk about love so much. And if we live from that place, I mean, we've seen the magic that's happened in the world.
Joe, and I know Nina sort of shared this just a little bit earlier, there's such a stigma around men opening up about mental health. How can we break that barrier?
It's a very valid point, Martin. And I can say personally, even from when, here I am at 10 years old, having lost both parents to suicide, trying to figure out the world and navigate that, it took me many decades to feel comfortable to open up. And I now, looking back, see that I needed those safe places, like a season center, like these different places that exist today. I also feel grateful to be able to now openly talk about it. But that took me a long time. It took me to be in a very safe place. I have an incredible wife, 2 daughters, incredible friend. I'm in a very safe place and comfortable to do that now on an open platform. So I think that we can just start small, right? It can just be like one-to-one with a friend. For men to, I think we just need to get over this idea. And honestly, I think we need to learn from women how incredibly powerful it is to cry. I cry in front of my daughters when I've had family members or friends pass away. I'm not going to just lock myself away or lock those feelings away. I'm going to express them. And man, is it ever therapeutic. So I think that to stop repressing and slowly let it be, because actually it's not weakness, it's incredible strength to be able to do that. So that's the remix. That's a flip that we need to change in our society.
What is the one thing you wish more men understood about their mental health and emotional well-being?
I would say that without it, we don't have much. We can put a lot of effort going to the gym. We can put a lot of effort into our physical appearance. Our mental health is just as important, if not more important. And so, I kind of look at it like I go annually to do a physical. I get checked in my mid-40s now, so there's other extra things I'm getting checked for. That should be the same for mental health. It shouldn't feel like we're at a scale of 9 to 10 of a crisis. No, it's ongoing maintenance. We all as a society, especially men, should be going to talk to someone, and that could be different, right, depending on the specialist or whatnot. But I think that getting over that fear of sharing is critical. So I think that making it more common, removing that stigma around sharing and getting help should be regular.
it's also on the men receiving the messages to receive it without judgment, without shame, with love. That's a really important piece as well, to just feel that's where the psychologically safe space comes from, and we want men to feel that in the presence of men.
Something you and I have talked about is the fact that trauma gets stuck in your nervous system. Trauma gets stuck in your fascial system, in your fascia. At the end of the day, we have to get that trauma out of our bodies. How do we do that? How do we let that shit go?
I think with trauma, we have to look it in the face, and we have to peel it back, and we have to unpack it, and it doesn't feel good. And you go through those of you who have been in therapy know sometimes it gets worse before it gets better. So I think with trauma, the acknowledgement and getting the help. And I, unfortunately, as incredible as my mom was, and I'll forever put her on a pedestal for the person that she was, sometimes I believe she was diagnosed with ALS because, she never actually cried about my brother. She was eternally happy, but there's a bit of toxic positivity. There's a bit of spiritual bypassing, they call it. Good vibes only. It's not like that. Life is not good vibes only. We can't always be good vibes only. So just being brutally honest with where we are, and kind of parallel pathing your life. You got to live, you got to move forward. That's something the Season Center taught me. You got to pick up, no one's going to pick up the pieces for you. You got to do it, and you got to move forward. But the healing part, also picking up, the trauma and the pieces that are, left inside of you, because until you bring them, we have a saying in the book, you can't let that shit go unless you bring that shit to surface. And that's what you need to do with the trauma, is bring it to surface and move through it.
But the fact in the Western medicine context, so many times we've separated out physical health and mental health. And just what a crime to humanity that is, in my opinion, because so many of the challenges that we see in this world and so many of the disconnection stems from ourselves, because we have that physical disconnection from our spiritual disconnection. And you and I have had these conversations about this, and you keep your spiritual health very much at the forefront. You clean and cleanse your spiritual engagement on an ongoing basis, because the work you do, which Martin does, is just so hard and so challenging.
I worked for many years monitoring the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis and skinheads. And when I did that work, I had a picture on my wall, a quote by Bell Hooks that said, "We must never become like that which we're fighting against." It was one of my North Stars. And I feel that in order to show up fully in love that we are talking about, we have to first put on that within ourselves, even before we leave our home. It has to be a continual process. It's a continual commitment for me in how we go about just living our lives.
Nina and Joe, this is such a powerful conversation, and I know that some of our listeners will be both inspired and to say what is the truth. Some will be triggered, and some it was going to bring forth some of the trauma and some of what people have repressed themselves. And so for those individuals who are looking for help, we will have in our show notes, both on the app and on the video, resources that are available, from your own books, of course, the two of you, to the organizations that can be made available for those who are looking for help. I'd be remiss if I didn't just quickly point out, in addition to the great resources of our incredible authors who are with us here today, The Body Keeps Score, of course, one of the seminal works about the physical connection on trauma. Being married to a psychologist, I'm going to put out some of the great things that, whether it's the Hoffman process, looking at some of the childhood trauma, Nina and Joe, I see you nodding your head, some of the great work that they do, cognitive behavioral therapy for people who are looking for help, seeing some of the great trauma supports out there. And I know, Arndrea, there's something really important that you want to share.
And I think it's also important for us all to highlight, too, that these resources will also include free resources, because we understand that everyone, may not can afford some, there are different, modalities or different ways to address all of this. But what we firmly believe is that should not be a barrier to mental health. So we really want to make sure that our listeners know that there are free resources that they could also look into that will be listed as resources.
Nina, I wanted to ask you, one of the people that you and I have spoken about extensively is Dr. Gabor Mate, of course, somebody who is one of the world's leading experts on trauma. You've read his books. What have you learned from Dr. Gabor Mate?
I don't think we understand as a society what trauma, we're just starting to understand what it means and all the types of trauma that's out there. The way that he acknowledges whether it's trauma as a society, or whether it's trauma as women, or whether it's trauma we keep in our body. Follow him on Instagram, follow him on socials. He is constantly posting about the podcast interviews he's doing, or little segments of his keynotes, and he has really taught me about really what trauma is, because I think everybody's gone through trauma to some degree. So understanding and acknowledging whether it's, when you were a child and how you were raised, or, in a relationship, the kinds of trauma that shows up, or as a child, as a parent. So he has really brought a lot of rigor to the definition of trauma, and I think identifying what it is. And it was really hard for me to move on. I felt like I was walking the halls as the murder-suicide girl. I couldn't sit through a class. I went from a straight A student to not being able to focus. And if you've read Oprah and Dr. Bruce Perry's book on what happened to you, you will understand that trauma impacts the brain. I just thought I was dumb all of a sudden. And so to have that validation of, actually your brain doesn't function as it used to, it was very frustrating. I couldn't focus. I couldn't retain anything. I couldn't do well in school.
Well, I was going to highlight, too, how it also provides that understanding also leads to healing in our world. One of the things that I'm fascinated by is, I remember a study, there's a group that worked in Boston that looked at the impact that poverty has on young people's brains. To your point, when you go through trauma, it literally impacts your brain. And they are now finding this with science. And so then when you say traditional things like, okay, well, in order to, get out of poverty, you write your goals, you do that. But those things, if you're not addressing the physically what's even happening in someone's brain, or understanding that brain, there are different parts that are wired differently because of the trauma, even that will help not only individuals, but that understanding, and will also, I think, bring a sense of healing to a lot of the things that we see in the world.
Absolutely. I had a pivotal moment with a university professor a few years ago. She wanted to do a fireside chat on mental health, and I was shocked because I'm going to be honest here and say I know you're all scholars, but after I barely I grazed through my degree, and I thought, what does a university professor want to do, talking to me? And I had told her, when I was in university, it was a few years after the incident, and I would sit through lecture and leave and have no idea what the lecture was about. And, I did some testing after and how it affected my memory. Just so much of your brain is focused on that. And, we had this Zoom call before the chat, this was years later, and she looked at me through the screen and said, the fact that you got out of bed and you put your clothes on and you got your backpack ready and you showed up to class is an absolute miracle. And it was such a validating moment for me. And I want everybody to acknowledge who's gone through trauma, it's okay if you're not operating with firing all cylinders and crazy career and it's okay that you have gone through things and you're not functioning as maybe you were. Give yourself grace and compassion for that. Can I ask a question to Arndrea and Martin? You have seen so much trauma, you've experienced it, with racism or even patriarchy with women. What inside of you keeps you going to fight this fight with love?
So, as a child, it was seeing love in action through my father, my mother, my grandfather as a pastor, my aunts and uncles. And it was fortunately the environment for me. I don't know how I would have been had I not been exposed to this method to navigate through so much change. But it was a physical example of what Dad did and what Mom did many years after Dad. So if it didn't have the example, as I said, I can't say that I would have maintained and sustained hope. But it was reinforcing situations and experiences, and understand that, you can never give up. You have to always, and it sort of is a decision. I mean, it's an intention. The intention is, and no matter what happens, every day we have to intend to deposit positiveness within the world. So that's just who I've chosen to be, and it reinforces itself. It's like what you all are sharing today on this podcast. I can't imagine how many people are going to be helped because you chose to show up and show up in a way that is helpful to what someone is going through right this moment.
For me, it was, I talked about earlier, having that quote and being mindful that of who I am being and showing up in the world. And that we will never eliminate hate or fear by bringing more of that into the world. And one of the things that I've been leaning on more and more is that quote of Gandhi, when he says that when he despairs, he thinks about that throughout history, it looks like tyranny and murderers would prevail. But when you really think about it, the way of love and truth and beauty has always prevailed over those things. We say a lot that, the movement for humanity, the civil rights movement, is a movement of faith. It always looked impossible until it was done. And so that remembrance of it, that the fact that I understand that it is all of us, this is our time in that collective long march in humanity. And what am I going to do with my time? Am I going to feed the flames of more fear and division and chaos? Or am I going to feed the flames of peace and justice and love? Am I going to feed the flames of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King and Gandhi and Mother Teresa and Nelson Mandela? That and also remembering, as a woman, remembering my power, our power. I think sometimes we look around and we feel powerless when the reality is that we're powerful. And to follow up on that, Nina, we've talked a lot, and I'm so glad that we've had the conversation about men's mental health because it's incredibly important. But I do want to ask on the other side that, women are often expected to carry the emotional labor in their relationships and in families. So how do you navigate that balance between supporting others but also protecting your own well-being, your own mental health?
I make the time for it. I schedule time for self-love and self-care. And I also say that self-love starts up here. We can go to all the spa days or spend time on the golf course or be with girlfriends, but how are we talking to ourselves? How is that imposter in there? What is it saying? So constantly being aware of what's going on up here. And, you talked about going to the gym, and we can't stop that mental health awareness, because we go to the gym for 6 months and we get the six pack and it doesn't stay if we stop going. So in the same way, constantly checking in and even budgeting a little bit for self-love and well-being and mental health. And it's not something I realized I needed to do till very recently, till really writing about it. I thought I got to start walking the walk. And it is so important for women in today's world because we tend to constantly feel guilty when we take time out for ourselves to in fact do that, because then we can serve the world that much better. If our cup is not full, our love is going to come from a place of exhaustion, of expectation, of obligation. So we want to fill our cup, and we want our love to come from the cup runneth over.
The overflow.
Overflow.
I love that. Well, and so is there a particular boundary that that you established in your own personal life to protect yourself and your mental health?
Meditation is really my self-care, and it's the way for me to plug in, if you will, to source, to truth, to love every day. I can't say I do it every single day, but it is really like brushing my teeth, a part of my routine. And most recently, I've said to myself, and I'm telling my girlfriends, intentionally do something once a month, whether that's a somatic healing session, whether that's a little massage, or whether sacrifice the dinner out or the drinks, and just have a little budget, maybe $100 a month for self-care, or even like I said, wake up and listen to a self-care podcast. So the boundary is really, the overall boundary is making sure that I'm not depleting and I'm not depleted.
You both have daughters, if I'm not mistaken. I've got 2 girls as well who I just absolutely love and adore. And I wanted to ask you, having conversations around mental health with your kids is really hard. And opening up that space is sometimes also really hard. How do we do it? How do we embrace this conversation with young ones and with teenagers? What tips or suggestions do you guys have?
I can start with the little, because Joe has a little and a teenager, so he can speak to the teen-tween phase, which I'm terrified for. But I think it's just not even sometimes explicitly saying, take care of your mental health. I think it's because they're little. So acknowledging their emotions, which is something, I can speak for myself, especially having immigrant parents. We never talked about emotions growing up. Like, it would be like 4-hour explosive fight, brother and I hiding in the room, and then next morning, like, what do you want for breakfast? Would you like some cereal, oatmeal, So mental health wasn't even talked about, acknowledged. So one thing with my daughter is every day when she comes home from school, we talk about it. We talk about, was there any bullying incidences? What happened? How did you feel? How do you feel about what's going on? Things happening in the family. So holding the space and making it a very psychologically safe space for children, I think, as they're little. And then, of course, there's practical applications like, mindfulness cards and yoga cards, and having a space in your home where, a calming center, so to speak. But I think, to start out as parents, it's really acknowledging their mental health. And, I read somewhere that kids' problems may seem small to us, but that's their biggest problem for them. So if someone stole an eraser and that's their biggest problem, and we're saying, it's just an eraser, they're going to learn that we're not acknowledging what's going on. And so it's really important, wherever they're at, to hold space.
Nina, I love that. Actually, I want to repeat that one more time, because as a parent, that really resonated with me, that idea that even if it seems small, that's the world of the child. That's so important. Yeah. So acknowledging it from that perspective, I love that tangible advice.
One of the things that I've learned as a parent is that to ask myself, does she need a lecture or love? Actually, I even do that with my husband. Because sometimes they just want, that they just need to be loved, to be seen, to be heard. There are some times that they need, that there might, there's time for instruction, and the wisdom is in knowing, which applies when.
Nina, what is one value you want to pass down to your daughter?
That is such a big question, and I would say for her to honor herself, for her to show up authentically every step of the way, and to be unapologetic about it, especially growing up as a woman in today's world is to just own who she is. And my mom, who is no longer with us, she passed away 10 years ago this year, taught me everything about life. I mean, talk about legacy. It's why I do what I do. I share this story all the time as she worked for a big bank. She was a bank executive. And she had one more year to retire. She had 25 years at the bank. She lived 24, one more year to retire. And most people would just work that year and say, okay, now I'm retired, I'm going to live my life. But this 1 year course came up at the ashram, and she said, I'm going to take a year sabbatical before her one last year to retirement. And she did that. And we came back from the course, and in those months, she started limping around. And before we knew it, she was diagnosed with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's. And I kept thinking, thank goodness she seized the day and did what she felt was important in that moment, because otherwise her last year of health would have been, working for the bank. And in the years that she was sick, she had about 2 years from her diagnosis to her passing. People still talk about how she'd be in her wheelchair and they'd come over and she would say, how are you? And what is going on with you? And she always just thought about others, literally until the day she died. And I shared this with you, Marc, when we were talking earlier, that she left me birthday cards and letters for my daughter before I was even pregnant. She didn't even know I was pregnant when she was leaving these letters with a best friend of mine. And so I have access to her wisdom, beyond her physical life. And, she made such incredible strides despite the fact that she was ill, and really lived to her fullest till her last day.
Nina, I'm just struck because, all of our stories are unique, but it's always so amazing to me of how much so many of us have in common. For me, my mother passed away 5 years ago. And like your mother, she was just this light. And, I know from personal experience how complex that situation is, mother and daughter, as your parent is transitioning, going from being a caretaker to just, preparing yourself, trying to prepare your children. I think for me, I was in the room when my mom took her last breath. And there was something so powerful to be with this magnificent human that gave birth to me at the time that she was exiting this world. Is there anything in particular that you feel would be helpful to any of our listeners who right now is going on that path of a parent transitioning?
Thank you for sharing that. It's a beautiful story, and I too was there when she took her last breath, and it is quite a moment when the person who brought you into this world is leaving this world. It's really full circle. And I would say the biggest thing I've learned is that they're actually not gone. They're very much, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, Arndrea, they're here. They're just not in physical form. But I would say, their essence, their spirit becomes you. They're so much of your heart. And practically, I'd say there's some tough conversations to have as a parent is transitioning. And one thing my mom and I learned was, let's not make this last year just about those tough conversations about wheelchairs and medication and what you need to do, every month and the hospitals. And let's make sure we're still talking about life, and we're still talking about love and spirituality and the meaning of life. And as she transitioned, now it's been 10 years, I still till this day get little signs from her all the time. And it's like I'm talking to her. I'm like, yes, Mom, I can hear you. Yeah, and I'm validating. But even though it feels, I'm not denying the grave loss and the lack of physical presence and how much it hurts to not get that phone call or not feel that hug. But if you really feel them in your heart, you'll hear them.
And I love, too, that you talked about how she left things even for her grandchildren, for your child. Because I'm also reminded when you think about signs and, the first time that a lot of people were introduced to our daughter was when she spoke at the March for Our Lives rally, which she did without any prior warning, literally two hours before she was on the stage. But what's interesting is that a week before that, and I wanted to make sure, like, when we went, she wasn't preparing to speak, but she got the phone call 2 hours before. But a week before that, she had a dream about Martin's parents. And in that dream, even her grandfather took her up some stairs, and then he was talking to her. And so it almost felt like at this moment when his grandchild was being introduced to the world and she was, going forward in her destiny, he in some manner was there. And not only that, because he, in the dreams, he talked to her and kind of coached her. So they are still a part of who we are.
Nina, it takes such courage to come onto this global conversation and to share your story, which you've done with rawness, with love, with humility, with emotion, and with wisdom. Joe, on behalf of a fellow male, I want to say thank you for having the courage to get up and stand up and talk about these traumas and encourage other men to talk about the traumas.
Nina and Joe, I just want to echo Marc's words of gratitude in this entire group. But what I think you added that was so powerful is we first have to have the courage to bring it up. And it's only when we have the courage to bring it up, to face it, to have those difficult moments like we had today with you, with that rawness, that vulnerability, that courage, can we truly let it go. And so to our listeners who have the trauma in their life that they're facing, to have the courage to face, to have the courage to work through it, and have the courage to let that shit go.
Thank you so much for having us on and giving the opportunity to continue to talk about our stories.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us on. We were pretty emotional when we got the call.
And I also want to congratulate you. I've known Craig, of course, my entire life, and of course, his entire life, as he's my brother. And in the 40 plus years that Craig has been on this earth, this is the first time I've ever heard him use the shit word and swear. So congratulations.
It's actually the first time since I was probably 6 or 7 years old I've actually ever used a word of profanity.
Yes.
My wife was teasing me. She's like, "You're going to introduce this book? You're going to say this book? You're going to bleep it yourself?"
So that book,
Yes.
Let That Sht Go, has taken us in terms of healing trauma, of course, and we love the book, but it's also now brought us closer together as brothers because I've been trying to get him to swear his entire life. So congratulations.
So I guess that's a win. I mean, for your kids, maybe not, but for us.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, subscribe and share the podcast with friends, family, and loved ones, and follow us on social media at My Legacy Movement. At the heart of this podcast is Dr. King's vision of the beloved community and the power of connection. This podcast is a testament to that vision and the product of collective effort, enriched by the voices, stories, and support of so many.